Welcome to I'm Your Target Demographic. Today we are covering the Weapon Plus program. A lot of you probably know that Weapon X is affiliated with Wolverine, but that may be all that you know. So we're going to cover what the other iterations are because X stands for 10, and so there were 9 before that, and then there were some after that. We're going to cover who some of those experiments were in very brief detail. Otherwise, this video would be hours long. So we're just going to cover who some of the highlights were, kind of what they could do, how the experiments were different, and kind of leading up to where we are now. I don't always get everything right, so if I get anything wrong or don't explain it properly, feel free in the comments to let me know. So the Weapon Plus program is basically a group of international scientists trying to create the perfect super soldier. This began as what we call Project Rebirth, which is where we get Captain America. But before Captain America, there was actually a Weapon Zero, before they even get to Weapon 1, a Weapon Zero that turned out kind of to be a test subject. And this is the mutant known as John Steele, who actually has impenetrable skin. So John Steele is actually kind of a corny name and kind of an obvious name. Anyways, they tested it out on him. They sent him out into World War II to fight Nazis, and he was a Nazi killing machine. So now they revamp things a little bit, and they get to what we call Weapon 1, which is kind of Project Rebirth as we know it. But before they managed to succeed with Captain America Steve Rogers, there were 2 significant tests that somewhat failed or didn't quite go right. The first one is a mutant by the name of Queen. The character that we call Queen is a mutant with kind of some arachnid-like powers, as well as a Marine, which is where she was kind of exposed to these experiments. Now, we don't see a lot of her back then, but she came up recently in some Spider-Man stories and Spider Island and all this stuff, and she's kind of more closely tied to Spider-Man, but she was part of these Project Rebirth experiments back in the day. The other failed experiment from back in World War II is a man by the name of Clinton McIntyre, and he goes by the name Protocide because he was the prototype, and he kills a bunch, so I guess that's where they get Protocide from. Anyways, he died. He did not actually kind of survive the experiment, but they put him on ice, and then the scientist group called AIM, which is Advanced Idea Mechanics, resurrected him recently, kind of brought him back to life, and he has all the same powers of Captain America, and he was kind of brainwashed by them, and he had some mental problems, and he kind of wasn't able to really cope with reality, and he's presumed dead, but there is an opening where he might still be alive. And now we get to Captain America, which we're not going to spend too much time on because a lot of you already know about Captain America. Steve Rogers was kind of a scrawny guy, wanted to help fight the war, was kind of given these powers through Project Rebirth to kind of, he was peak human, faster, stronger, than the average person. So this was a success. But they weren't only trying this experiment on Steve Rogers. There were other experiments happening concurrently. And one of these is where we get another Captain America by the name of Isaiah Bradley. Isaiah Bradley is one of the only survivors of this group of about 300 African American soldiers that they kind of put in this experiment. And he is one of the only survivors. He got the same abilities as Captain America, so peak human standards. He wanted to go fight the war. So he kind of went out, he just did it. He stole Captain America's outfit and shield in order to fight. Now, this is a little weird, but he was arrested because he stole Captain America's outfit. And he was basically put in jail for a long, long time because of this. Now, because he was in jail, and because he maybe didn't get the treatments he needed, his mind started to deteriorate. And when he was released from prison about 17 years later, they say that he has the mind of a child, that he's basically kind of devolved into his childlike state. But since they were concurrent, both Steve Rogers and Isaiah Bradley are both considered Captain America, and they're also both considered Weapon 1. So now we go on to Weapon 2. Weapon 2, they were like, hey, we tried on people, let's try on animals first. Maybe we did this backwards. And from Weapon 2, we get some crazy results. Most notably, we get this squirrel-like creature that was given basically Wolverine's powers and abilities before they got to Wolverine. So there's this squirrel with claws and a healing factor. It's a bit humorous, and he was involved in a lot of like Howard the Duck arcs, and so it's a bit of a satire, but it is considered canon. So Weapon 2 is this little animal and other animals like him. Now, Weapon 3 in our timeline hits at about the Cold War. So between kind of America and Russia, and there's some nuclear threats happening. And so Weapon 3 is a mutant that they were testing things on by the name of Harry Pizer. And it could be pronounced something else. He's British. Is Pizer a name? I'm going to go with Pizer because that's the way it looks phonetically. Harry Pizer is a mutant with elastic skin that can kind of stretch, and it's almost sentient in that it can control itself. So they do some experiments on him. They send him out into the field as kind of a spy espionage type character. Now, some of these pictures are a little gruesome because in a mission gone sideways, he was actually captured by the good guys, the Captain Britain Corps, and while he kind of made some mistakes, and they punished him by removing his skin from him. That seems like something the bad guys would do, but whatever. But still, he taught his muscles to act the way that his skin did. So even now that he did not have skin, he could still had this elastic-like nature, and he became known as the Skinless Man. Now, of course, after all this, he's pretty upset. He becomes a villain. He works with the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants for a time. He has a rivalry with another Weapon Plus alumni, I want to say by the name of Phantom X, and we'll get to him later, so the Skinless Man will reappear when we get to that point in the story. Now, at this point in our timeline, Weapons 4, 5, and 6, we don't really know anything about. There aren't really any significant characters that come out of them. There's not a lot of history there. So this leaves it open for Marvel to go back and say this person or this thing happened during these times. It kind of gives them some flexibility. And again, as of right now, in the year 2017, when I'm recording this, there aren't really a lot that happened during this time. The only thing we know about this time span of Weapons 4, 5, and 6 is that they might have been doing experiments on ethnic groups like they did with Isaiah Bradley, that they might have been testing how things react to different types of people. That's really all we know. So let's move on to Weapon 7. Weapon 7 comes out as a result of the Vietnam War. And so they're testing on human soldiers that are going to Vietnam. And we get a character by the name of Frank Simpson who goes by the name Nuke. Nuke has an American flag tattooed on his face, and he is psychotic and brutal. And how they're experimenting with normal people is they're amping up their abilities using these pills that they kind of boost and amplify their adrenaline and their pain receptors. But then they need these pills to come down because if they take too many of these pills, they might just have a heart attack and die. So they're kind of going up and down using these pills. If this sounds familiar, Frank Simpson was actually a character on the Netflix show Jessica Jones. Of course, he did not have the tattoo, but the same idea of taking these pills, trying to become a super soldier, was still there. It was alluded to that he was part of a bigger program experimenting on this. We hit another blank spot here with Weapons 8 and 9. The only things we know about this era, kind of in between wars, I guess, is that they were experimenting with hypnosis and sleeper agents that people may have been kind of tested with and experimented with in the Weapon Plus program and then put out into the field totally unaware of this training that they had. So again, Marvel could go in and say, this character was a sleeper agent, Weapon 8 during this time, and they could retcon that immediately. So they kind of left the door open for that. And then we get to Weapon X, or Weapon 10. And Weapon X takes place mostly in Canada, though it is still an international program, that it is funded partially by the CIA, that there's a lot of other agencies involved in the Weapon X program. So they're experimenting specifically on mutants. And so we get this group of mutants that are kind of trained and maybe given abilities through the Weapon X program. The most notable one, and the one that we even call Weapon X, is Wolverine. Wolverine has a healing factor. At this point, he's been alive a long time. He's served in a lot of wars. He was a soldier in the Weapon Plus program long before he was experimented on and given his adamantium skeleton and claws. There was another member of the Weapon X team that had this healing factor by the name of Sabretooth. And so because of Wolverine and Sabretooth, they said, we can really experiment with some crazy stuff with very low risk because they can survive it. And so that's why the two of them went through some pretty rigorous experiments. There were plenty of other Weapon X soldiers that during this time kind of fought with them in and out, but maybe they weren't as experimented with as Wolverine and Sabretooth. So characters like Maverick. So Maverick was a mutant that served with them, maybe got little abilities, little enhancements, but nothing as significant as what we saw these other mutants go through. They even explained that some of these characters had no memory, or they didn't remember a lot of this, because there was another mutant named Cyborg, P-S-I, Borg, Cyborg, who could change or get rid of their memories. And so they even said, like, hey, there's some things you don't remember about this time because of this guy. Now, Weapon X lasted for a long time because it was pretty successful. We even saw the creation of heroes like Deadpool, whose healing factor was amped up even more than like Wolverine's is, that Deadpool is essentially unkillable. We also saw a peer of Deadpool's named Ajax, who appeared in the Deadpool film as the villain. That Ajax was kind of part of the Weapon X program as well as being enhanced by the Weapon X program. Now, as a reminder, this isn't strictly Canadian, that there were Weapon X experiments happening elsewhere. And one of these was in Russia, where they got Omega Red, who is a villain in the X-Men books, who basically has all sorts of kind of crazy abilities, and he has tendrils that can come out of his hands that are similar to adamantium, but not adamantium. So there's experiments everywhere. There's a lot of stories about Weapon X. There's a lot of stories about the alumni of the Weapon X programs and what they do and don't remember and going back. And so I'm not going to go into all the details of Weapon X, but if you're interested in those stories, there's plenty of them out there about their escapades. The only other person I want to talk about before we move on from Weapon X is what we call X-23, which is basically the 23rd kind of test, I guess, of the Weapon X program or something like that. That she is a clone of Wolverine, meaning she has all of Wolverine's inherent mutant abilities, so like the healing factor, but they also give her the claws. They kind of tried to make her a replica of him because he was so successful. Now, when we get to Weapon 11, there is no Weapon 11 in the comic books, but they did reference in the Wolverine Origins movie, they turned Deadpool into Weapon 11, that they said he's the next iteration, he's the next advancement in this line, where in the comic books they were kind of peers, they were in the same batch. In the movies, he was kind of the next evolution, but again, in the comics, there is no Weapon 11 yet. Okay, now following this, we get a little crazy, meaning the rest of this was relatively tame so far. Looking forward, there is now a place called The World, capital T, capital W, The World. And this is basically an environment that is created using Sentinel technology, kind of mutant hunting technology, as well as nanites that can kind of replicate and reproduce and create soldiers on their own. And so this environment is basically the catalyst for a lot of things moving forward. That all of these future Weapon Plus experiments are kind of created in this environment or by this environment. So when we get to Weapon 12, we have a character called the Huntsman. And I apologize, these pictures are horrible. I only have access to what's out online, and there are very few and very bad pictures of the Huntsman. This is basically a soldier that was created that could kind of pass from person to person and kind of mind control them. So if he came in contact with someone, he could control that person. Think of it almost like a hive mind, that if he could contaminate someone, they would have his ideals, his mission, and so it kind of became an ever-growing army with one mindset. However, the world builds in a shutdown button, like basically a self-destruct, and the Huntsman was shut down. Now, Weapon 12 was meant to have two partners, Weapon 13 and Weapon 14. Weapon 13 rebelled. It did not want to be a mutant hunting machine. Weapon 13 we call Phantom X. Phantom X is a creation. He is kind of part human biology, but kind of supplemented with this Sentinel technology. He is basically an enhanced cyborg clone creation. Phantom X basically did not want to hunt mutants, rebelled, and kind of served alongside the X-Men in several capacities. Phantom X is interesting in that his nervous system is outside of his body in a giant machine called EVA, which stands for something, EVA. EVA can kind of act on her own, as well as helping and assisting him. Super interesting, but very confusing. You can look up stuff about Phantom X if that interests you. Now, Phantom X had a rivalry with the Skinless Man, right? So we talked about way back in the day. And they had a rivalry because they were both Weapon Plus agents, but Skinless Man kind of did whatever he was told, and Phantom X rebelled, and there was kind of this rivalry. Phantom X ended up using his skin that, it was taken from him. Phantom X stole the skin, and the skin is sentient. So Phantom X made bullets, and these bullets never miss because they can control themselves. They have a mind of their own. So now Phantom X has these incredible bullets made from the skin of the skinless man, which is pretty morbid. And I just remembered a correction. I said that weapon 12, 13, and 14 were meant to be teammates, but that is wrong. It is 12, 13, and 15 because weapon 14 is something very different and very unique. Weapon 14 is something that we call the Stepford Cuckoos. And this is super weird. Basically, the world has gotten genetic material from Emma Frost, who is a popular telepathic mutant. And they're basically cloning her thousands of times. And so there are thousands of these clones, and they release 3 of them to go into kind of the mutant ranks of the X-Men and kind of serve as spies. And using their telepathic abilities, they're kind of sending information back to the world to then kind of hunt down and kill these mutants. And I might be wrong about how many they sent because these clones are, some of them die, some of them, the numbers may change. There are literally thousands. So maybe when they get to the X-Mansion, there might be more than 3. There might be 5. But I know 3 is significant because for a long time they are known as the 3-in-1, which is maybe the core 3 that maybe survive this whole thing. And when I say this whole thing, oh gosh, this is so confusing to summarize in a few minutes. The Phoenix shows up and inherits 3 of their bodies and is going to use them for evil. But they, using their power of Emma Frost, being one of the world's most powerful telepaths, basically shut the Phoenix Force inside them in exchange for no longer feeling emotion. That they kind of use, she has this ability to become diamond hard. And they kind of use this to like capture the Force inside them, but then that makes them hard, like emotionally. And so they basically kind of sacrifice themselves to hold this energy in. This also destroys the rest of the clones, kind of the world, that whole factory of creating Emma Frost clones is kind of shut down, and now there's the 3 of them left. But again, before that, there may have been more than 3. I didn't really read this arc, and it's super confusing just to read summaries of. All right, so now we get to Weapon 15. Weapon 15 is part of the trio of Phantom X and the Huntsman, and then what we call Ultimaton. Ultimaton is, or Ultimaton, I think is right, Ultimaton. The 3 of them were meant to be the exterminators, right? Go out and kill mutants. But the Huntsman was shut down. Phantom X rebelled. The problem with Ultimaton is that he kind of struggled with his place. He was kind of let out prematurely, and he had these issues with like, do I kill mutants? Am I supposed to be doing this? He had kind of this struggle internally, even though he was meant to be kind of the ideal Sentinel, and even looks like a Sentinel. But he struggled with this and eventually was destroyed, but resurrected by Phantom X to serve as basically a babysitter and guardian for other story devices. So Ultimaton was kind of repurposed as a protector. And as far as I know, we haven't seen him since then. And now our last numbered weapon is Weapon 16 so far. And at this point, the world has become kind of self-sentient, that it has started creating things on its own. And it creates a virus. God, this is so weird. It creates this virus that infects people that have a religious affiliation. That if anyone has faith in something, this virus affects them, and it turns this faith to something called the All God, which is what kind of this virus is called. Super weird. And so it's infecting kind of the world. Phantom X, kind of our hero of the story, doesn't have any religious affiliation. Neither does characters like Wolverine. There's a couple others that are able to fight off this virus because they are not affected by it. So they shut down the virus and they basically destroy the world, capital T, capital W, shut it down. But there's another reason to destroy the world, capital T, capital W. And that is, there's a storyline where basically creations from the future are sent back in time. And it's believed that the world has to do with their creation. So that might also instigate why to destroy the world at this time. And this is called Weapon Infinity, or Weapon Infinite, Weapon Infinity, I believe. And it's basically Deathlock. And Deathlock is an experiment where soldiers are kind of created into cyborgs. So they start to use dead bodies and they reanimate them in the future as soldiers. It then evolves to the point where they're able to capture heroes and turn them into these cyborgs. So it kind of brainwashes them. It gives them usually like a typical plate and a red eye, so you kind of know who's been transformed. And these start to come back into the past with a purpose. So that is all we've seen so far. So there's kind of three eras. There's pre-Weapon X, right? So all of these kind of super soldier experiments, a lot of failures, things maybe didn't go so right. There's Weapon X, which a lot of people come out of because it's finally when mutants are kind of tapped into, things start to go right. And then there's post-Weapon X, which is really the world, kind of using this place to create super soldiers, and then this place becomes self-sentient and starts to create viruses, anything it can do to help wipe out the mutant population. So it's kind of those three. And that's it so far. But again, this is kind of prime real estate to go back and say this person is actually a sleeper agent. This person is actually a failed experiment from Weapon 4. They can say anything. So hopefully this was interesting. Again, I apologize some of the pictures are horrible, and I apologize that I have to skim through stuff that are entire arcs, and I'm oversimplifying. But if any of this sounds interesting, you're like, Phantom X sounds cool, look up that character, look up what you should be reading in regards to what sounds interesting to you. So thanks for watching. Make sure you subscribe for other stuff like this. Congratulations if you made it this far. We'll see you next time.